Okay, so at its very core, an easement is a right to use someone else's land for a very specific purpose. The piece of land that gets the benefit of the right, that's called the dominant tenement. It's in the dominant position, right? And the land that has to put up with the burden, the one being walked over or having pipes run under it, that's the servient tenement. It's literally serving the other property.
The most classic example is a right-of-way. Think about the right to light, or a right of drainage. You can even have an easement for support. A positive easement, it lets you actively do something on your neighbor's land. But a negative easement, it stops your neighbor from doing something on their own land. Because these are so restrictive on a landowner's freedom, the courts are incredibly cautious about creating new ones. In fact, they've pretty much said they're not going to. A principle really locked in by the case Phibbs versus Pierce.
To be legally recognized, a right has to pass a four-part test. This test is the absolute foundation of modern easement law, and it was all laid out in Re Ellenborough Park. If a right fails even one of these four rules, it cannot be an easement.
First, there have to be two distinct pieces of land, a dominant one that benefits and a servient one that's burdened. Second, you can't have an easement over your own land. The two properties must have different owners or occupiers. Third, the right has to accommodate the dominant land. This means it has to benefit the land itself, not just be a personal bonus for the current owner. And finally, the right has to be clear and definite enough.
What does it actually mean for a right to accommodate the land?
Two classic Victorian cases show this distinction perfectly. First, in Hill v. Tupper, a man was granted the exclusive right to put pleasure boats on a nearby canal for his business. The court said, nope, that's not an easement. That right is just a personal business advantage for you. It doesn't actually benefit your piece of land. Now contrast that with Moody v. Steggles. Here, a pub owner claimed an easement to hang a sign on his neighbor's house. The court said, yes, that sign directly benefits the land as a pub. It's essential to how that specific property functions as a business. See the difference? One was personal, the other was intrinsically linked to the land's use.
But how do these rights actually spring into existence?
There are really three main ways this happens. The simplest and cleanest is by express creation. It's written down, clear as day, in a formal deed. Then you have prescription, which is basically acquiring a right because you've been openly using it for a very long time. Think over 20 years. But the most legally fascinating is implied creation. This is where a court looks at a situation and says an easement must exist, even though nobody ever wrote it down.
And on one of the most interesting types of implied creation, it's known as an easement of common intention. This is where a court examines the facts and concludes that, even though it wasn't written down, the parties must have intended for this right to exist for the property to be used as planned.
The idea is that an easement is a limited right over a piece of land. It can't be so huge and intrusive that it effectively kicks the owner off their own property. It can't oust them. In the classic case, Copeland versus Greenhalgh, a man had been parking and repairing vehicles all over a strip of his neighbor's land for 50 years. The court said, sorry, that's not an easement. Your use is so total it leaves no room for the actual owner. It amounts to exclusive possession.
In Batchelor v. Marlowe, a garage claimed the right to park 6 cars on a neighbor's strip of land all day, every single weekday. The Court of Appeals said no, that's too much. It leaves the owner with no reasonable use of their land during business hours. But then look at London and Blenheim. A right to park generally in a large car park was allowed because it didn't stop the owner from using the car park in other ways or for other people. At the end of the day, it's always a question of degree. How much does this right really interfere with the owner's own use of their land?
Making sure an easement is properly protected is absolutely critical, and how you do it depends on whether the land is in the modern registered system. If it is, any expressly created easement must be noted on the official title register. Implied easements are a bit of a special case. They can sometimes bind a new owner automatically as an overriding interest, especially if the easement is obvious on a physical inspection of the land. But the key takeaway in the modern world is this: getting that right officially registered is the only surefire way to protect it.
So, how do you get rid of an easement? Well, they can end if both landowners agree to it, or if one person ends up owning both properties. But the most legally interesting way is through abandonment. Can an easement just sort of fade away if it's not used? The answer is yes, but the courts have set an incredibly high bar to prove it.
And these two cases show just how high that bar is. In Swan v. Sinclair, a right-of-way hadn't been used for 50 years, and the owners had put up fences blocking it. The court said that combination, the long non-use plus the physical act of fencing it off, showed a clear intention to abandon the right.
But then you get the mind-blowing case of Ben v. Hardinge. Here, a right-of-way went completely unused for an unbelievable 175 years. But because no one ever actually blocked it off, the court ruled the easement was still legally alive and could be used again. It just proves that simply not using a right, even for nearly 2 centuries, is not enough. You have to demonstrate a positive intention to give it up for good.